The historicists see Quranism as a method that distorts the text. In other words, as Abdu puts it, you devote yourself to the Quran and the Quran reveals itself to you. It's somewhat like an esoteric expectation and anticipation of a discovery. There are as many modern rulings as there are modernists. There are rulings both through Quranism and through historicism. The era we call the age of codification, as Jabiri puts it, modernists generally think that during the codification era of Muhammad Jabiri, these efforts to interpret were distorted. For example, they believe that during the Umayyad period, the Umayyad political agenda corrupted it. And during the Abbasid era, it was attacked by the Abbasids, causing those interpretive approaches to deviate from their essence, so they disregard them. The text of the Quran is enough for us. Now, this is the Quranist perspective.
Hello to everyone from Okulu. Dear viewers, today we will talk about Quranism and Historicism in Islamic Modernism. Our guest is Professor Dr. Mehmet Ali Büyükkara. Welcome, Professor.
Glad to be here.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Professor, in our previous program we talked with you about Quranism. We discussed it in the context of Islamic modernism. Well, we know that the foundation of Islamic modernism is the Quran. They talk about Quranism based on this foundation, but is it just Quranism? Here, as a method, can the Quran establish a sufficient connection with changing social norms? How does Islamic modernism view this? What do you think?
In the previous program, we discussed why Islamic modernism regards the Quran as the sole source. To repeat it in a few sentences, well, they say that the problem today is not with Muslims themselves. That is, Muslims are facing certain problems. In the modern era, they have fallen behind. Culturally, scientifically, and economically, they have faced difficulties, lost their independence, and failed to establish good governance. There are still issues we constantly talk about today. It is a troubling situation among Muslims. Muslims who once experienced that brilliant medieval era are, well, not in a good state today. What is the reason for this? The reason for this, as Muslims, has generally been seen as such up to now. In other words, there is no problem with Islam itself. Islam is not an obstacle to progress, to use the old expression. That is, it is not a barrier to development or advancement. So the fault lies with the Muslims, with the institutions of Muslims, with the morals of Muslims, with the behavior of Muslims. Islamic modernists do not accept this. They say, no, that's not the case. The fault does not lie with the Muslims. The fault lies in the religion that has come down to us as Islam today. Their tradition is to blame. In modern times, these traditions, such as the Sufi orders that aim to develop spiritual life in terms of understanding the Quran, understanding the Hadiths, understanding faith and belief, and the higher tradition of Sufism, these have no value today. They don't mean anything, and in fact, they even hinder the progress of Muslims. So in that case, we need to question these things. How are we going to question them? Are we going to question them through the Quran? No, the Quran stands before us as the only source. We will pave the way for Muslims today with the Quran. The problems of Muslims today will be resolved with the Quran. Or, to put it more accurately, they will be resolved. I mean, doesn't the Quran itself say this? I am sufficient, I am a healer, I am enough. I am a book that has been made clear. I am a book that explains. Isn't it a book that has been detailed, that lays out everything in detail, a book in which everything dry and fresh is found? In that case, the Quran is sufficient for us. There is an approach that says the only source is the Quran, the only source is the Mushaf. But as you asked at the beginning, how are we going to achieve this? In other words, how are we going to look at the Quran? Here, we see that there isn't just one method, and that even among modernists, there are at least two main streams. The first of these is Quranism It's also called Quranic Islam. It's referred to as Quraniyun. It's also called the people of the Quran. Since those who don't know Arabic read the Quran through translations, it's called translationism. For example, in Turkey, the name of this Quranist movement is mostly known as translationism. They say that the Quran is timeless. In other words, Almighty God revealed the Quran, and until the Day of Judgment, this Quran has a structure that addresses every era. Muhammad Abduh used to say, devote yourself to the Quran, try to understand the Quran. The Quran will reveal itself to you. So when you devote yourself to it, the Quran will show itself to you. You come to understand things you previously couldn't. If you devote yourself to the Quran, you can find answers there to questions in the modern age that you couldn't solve or find answers to. There's absolutely no need for help from any other source. So then by updating the Quran, the text is universal. That's why the universalist approach is also called Quranism. It's also called the textualist approach, because the text that we see as verses there is universal. It addresses every era, every geography. This text is valid until the Day of Judgment. It needs to be emphasized without the need for any other source, and I want to underline that. So what does the classical, widely accepted mainstream say? All right, the Quran is universal, but our Prophet also explained it. Yes, since the companions knew the process of the verse's revelation and how the revelation came, we seek help from them. And they say there are also the collective agreements of scholars, which we call consensus, ijma, and they also bring those supports into play. Modernists generally think that during the era known as the era of codification, a term used by Mohammed Jabiri, these efforts to interpret were distorted. For example, during the Umayyad period, they were subjected to the influence, even the assault of Umayyad politics. During the Abbasid period, they were subjected to the assault of the Abbasids. Believing that these methods of interpretation deviated from their essence, they disregard them. The text of the Quran is sufficient for us. Now, this is the Quranist approach. The historicist approach, however, does not accept this. First, who are the Quranists? Who are the well-known Quranists? Perhaps that should be mentioned before moving on to historicism. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is the founder of the Ali Quran School in the Indian subcontinent. He was an Islamic scholar and intellectual who lived in the 19th century. He held a perspective that was content with the Quran alone. He did not reject the Sunnah, but he introduced different criteria, considering it only as supportive of the Quran. In other words, it had to be compatible with nature, with science, with reason, and so on. Then in Egypt, there is the Muhammad Abduh School. There are also figures who came after that school, such as Ahmed Tevfik. And up to the present day, quite a few names have emerged, both in the regions of Pakistan and India, as well as in Egypt and Syria. Quranism is older, while historicism is a more recent movement. Its founding father is Fazlur Rahman. He was an active Islamic intellectual in the 1950s and 60s.
Could you touch a bit on the difference between these two, Professor? Quranism, historicism?
So now, historicists see Quranism as a distorting method. In other words, as Abduh puts it, you devote yourself to the Quran and the Quran reveals itself to you. It's somewhat like an esoteric expectation and anticipation of a kind of spiritual discovery. Since you don't accept the help of other sources, whatever you understand from the text becomes what the Quran is telling you. That becomes what the Quran is addressing to the present age. Historicism sees this as a distortion. In other words, this is somewhat like an expectation of spiritual discovery, a kind of Sufi anticipation. The historicists say the text was revealed once. Allah the Exalted sent it down in that era, so it belongs to that era. It was revealed in the language of that time. Therefore, only if we know that era can we understand the text. That text belongs to that era. So what does that era signify? How do we understand this? Fazlur Rahman proposes a method called the double movement method. He says that first, we return to the time when the Quran was revealed. We go back to the time of its revelation. There we try to understand for what purpose that Quranic verse or group of verses was revealed, what it was meant to change, what it was meant to establish. That verse, that text is there waiting to be discovered.
So, Professor, here you are talking about a contextual perspective of historicism, about what happened during that period and what the revelation was responding to. Then they also need to take hadith and the sunnah into account.
They do take them into account. Yes, what you said is absolutely right. So the narrative material that the Quranists disregard becomes very valuable for historicists. For example, why was that verse revealed? The reports we call Asbab al-Nuzul, the reasons for revelation, and the narrative commentaries, especially Tabari, as well as the reports about the Prophet's life, which we call Sirah, become very important. Because why was that verse revealed? We need to understand this, and that's what we're trying to grasp. So the first movement thus reached its conclusion, it came to an end. Then why was that verse revealed, or what was the group of verses trying to change? What was it trying to establish? We understood this? We leave the text there in history. The text does not come to the present day. It's the purpose, the intention behind it. So what should we call that?
Core message.
The core message, the main principles of the Quran. This is the expression generally used. We carry that into the present day. The text stays there, but we bring that forward to today. Whatever ruling that principle sets for us today, whatever it puts before us, that becomes the ruling of the Quran and therefore of God. If we explain this with an example, I think our listeners will understand it much better. There is verse 38 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, the verse known as the theft verse, the verse that prescribes punishment for thieves. I seek refuge with Allah. As for the male thief and the female thief, cut off their hands as a recompense for what they have earned as a deterrent from Allah. This is the text of the verse. In other words, the male thief and the female thief, when they commit theft, as a punishment from Allah, cut off their hands. Now, in the four Sunni schools of thought, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali, non-Sunni schools as well, like Zaidi, Isna Ashari, Shia, Jafari, and so on. In other words, including the non-mainstream sects, this phrase, Faqta'u aydiyahuma, meaning cut off their hands, has been understood in this way. That is, this punishment is a penalty decreed by Allah. It is the limit. But there may be certain reasons that can prevent this punishment from being applied. For example, Caliph Omar did not enforce the punishment during a time of famine because people were hungry and had to steal out of necessity. Or, for instance, if the stolen item was left out in the open, it was not considered theft and the hand was not cut off. Or if there were not enough witnesses and so on. So not every thief necessarily has their hand cut off.
According to certain criteria. So this is the situation. In other words, this is a situation on which there is consensus. Now, modernists, for example, generally do not consider this punishment to be modern. Why don't they consider it modern? First of all, there's blood involved and the act of cutting off a hand and so on.
It's not humane.
It is seen as not humane or in quotation marks. That's one reason. Second, they don't see it that way either. In other words, they don't see it as a reasonable or effective punishment. Because what are you doing by cutting off the thief's hand? Well, you make him unemployed. You render him unable to work. In other words, you disconnect him from life. He is in need. Maybe he stole because he was in need. It makes him even more destitute. They say this doesn't fit with modern times. So what are we going to do?
They don't see it as a rehabilitative solution.
They don't. Yes. So what are we going to do here now? Now, we're going to see the two different approaches of the two schools of thought we've been trying to distinguish. What do the Quranists say? They refer to the verse. What is the key word there? Faqtu aydiyahuma. Cut off his hand. Cutting off the hand, that is, cutting from the wrist. This is a specific meaning. But the word gata, in Arabic, it means to cut. But when we open the dictionary, when we look at Arabic dictionaries, we find 10 or 20 different meanings for gata. So it doesn't necessarily mean to sever and throw away. For example, elsewhere in the Quran, when the women gossip about the relationship between Prophet Joseph and the wife of Pharaoh in Surah Yusuf, Pharaoh's wife brings him out in front of those gossiping women, as described in the story, in order to make a point to them.
In the Quran, it is stated as follows: there is no God but Him. They saw Him. When they saw how handsome He was, they were amazed, and they had been given knives in their hands. They cut their hands with the knives. Fekatana, gata is also mentioned there. So as we understand from the Quran and the commentaries, those women weren't chopping off their fingers.
Nor were they cutting at the wrist and severing their hands.
They're not severing them. So what are they doing? When they see Him, they become captivated by His beauty. They just end up cutting their hands, that's all. So they say, that's it. So then what should we do with the thief? We'll mark his hand, so he won't do it again, so he'll be ashamed, embarrassed. Or we'll cut off his means of stealing. Another Quranist modernist derives such a meaning from gata. We will make it so that he can no longer steal. We will make him self-sufficient. This is the Quranist interpretation. Now the historicists say, well, this is nonsense. I mean, this is not something that can be accepted. If you sat down and wrote a new Quran yourself, maybe that would make more sense. Because when this verse was revealed, the companions at that time understood it this way, and our Prophet also implemented it. There are narrations related to this. So where do we place this? He even said, even if my daughter Fatima were to steal, I would apply this to her. I mean, these hadiths also exist. Where do you place this? This is not about injuring the hand or anything like that. It's outright cutting it off. So what happens then? We go back to that period. This is Fazlur Rahman's double movement method. We go back to that period. Then we try to understand in what context that verse was revealed. I mean, what exactly? First of all, there's deterrence at the top of the list. I mean, this is a severe punishment. But can it really be this harsh? For example, Fazlur Rahman offers an interpretation like this. He says that in that period, theft meant actually breaking into a house, stealing something from a closed place, and then leaving with it. In that context, the value of the stolen property was not the issue. This is a severe punishment because it can't be justified by the value of the stolen item. Here, the privacy of the home has been violated. This felt extremely harsh to people of that era. I mean, you're breaking down the door. You're violating the family's privacy. That's the real issue here. It's not about stealing a few dirhams, dinars, gold, or silver. The punishment was given because the sanctity and honor of the home were violated. That's why such a severe punishment was imposed. Now let's come to the present day. We've identified these points. Deterrence, that's humiliation.
There is an attack on human rights.
An attack, in other words, an assault on human dignity. Notice it's not an attack on a person's property, but on their honor. That's why the punishment is so severe. So let's look at today. Today, when a burglary happens, do people say, was my honor attacked? Or do they immediately open the safe and think, how much money, checks, or promissory notes did I lose? In other words, material loss is what's important in today's modern sense. Therefore, there's no need to apply the punishment from that era today. Today, compensation for the loss and whatever deterrent punishment will prevent it from happening again, that's the appropriate penalty. Who decides on that? Experts of that era, scholars, or when we say scholars, not just in Islamic sciences, but also people who are experts in fields like psychology or sociology, would come together and make a decision. In one region, a certain punishment might be appropriate, while in another region, a different punishment could be applied. A century later, there might be yet another kind of punishment. What matters is that we left the text of the verse there in history. So what is the situation today? They say we look at this and make a judgment accordingly. Now, in both movements, look, the Quranism approach went in a different direction. By approaching the Quran, it produced a new interpretation. And the historicists also produced a different interpretation. In both cases, the command فَقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا, cut off their hands, has been abolished.
It's as if it's a method that is not used in either approach.
So here, modernism is entering into something completely new. So the Quranists are going this way, historians this way. But in the end, for both of them, what is called consensus is eliminated. Of course, is this a method that can be applied to the entire Quran, especially for the historicists? Fazlur Rahman says, if we apply this, then there would be nothing left that could be called the Quran. So we need to draw a red line somewhere. This mostly applies to what we call the civil verses, that is, civil law, inheritance. Then matters like women's veiling would fall under this as well. Testimony, divorce, then punishments for crimes, the penalties given for offenses. These are implemented. For example, they say that we do not apply historicism to matters of worship and morality. He himself explicitly states this. Those are universal. But when we look at what came after Fazlur Rahman, when we look at historicism, we see that this red line has been crossed. In other words, it is extended even to acts of worship. Then they call it prayer. For instance, at the time when the Quran was revealed, people used to worship their Lord in that way. Or, for example, they would discipline their souls by fasting for 30 days during Ramadan. Today, this has no meaning. In other words, they include acts of worship in this as well. So a very broad permissiveness emerges, such as making something forbidden permissible or making something permissible forbidden. And this is actually the biggest problem of modernism today.
Yes, teacher, actually, this was exactly what I wanted to ask, and you have already answered it. So where do we draw the line here? Yes, regarding rights and law, with the modern era and the modern legal system, there may be some changes in perspective and changes in daily life. But when it comes to acts of worship, we need to draw a line here and interpret this differently.
Yes, but on the other hand, where do we stop? That's unclear, really. That's why there are as many modern rulings as there are modernists. There are rulings based on Quranism, and there are also rulings based on historicism. Another important point of criticism against historicism is, well, as we said, they consider the verses and their texts as historical, and they don't find them relevant to today, as we mentioned. They also say this, for example, this view is found in Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, who is one of the important Egyptian historicists. To a certain extent, it's also present in Fazlur Rahman, but the main person who expresses this is the Iranian historicist, modernist Abdul Karim Soroush. They say, the Quran was revealed to our Prophet in terms of meaning. Our Prophet interpreted it with his own language and intellect and put it into text. In other words, the meaning of the verses belongs to God, but the text belongs to our Prophet. It's related to the language of that time. Therefore, since the text belongs to our Prophet and to that historical period, and since it aimed to convey something in the language of that era, that text does not carry over to today. What matters is the divine meaning behind it.
Yes.
This has also been a serious accusation that has led to the excommunication of historicists in many places, for example, in Egypt and Pakistan.
Yes, it seems so, Professor. There are very different perspectives, both Quranism and historicism. This has turned out to be a lesson-like program, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope it was understood.
Hopefully, Professor, thank you.
Because when people hear modernism, they tend to think of it as a single concept. The difference between these two movements is not well known.
Yes, that's truly an important point. Because as you said, we see modernism simply as a way of understanding religion in the modern era that rejects traditionalism. But both Quranism, historicism, and the distinction between them are very valuable. You have presented a different perspective on each of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dear viewers, today we talked about Quranism and historicism. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.